Hollywood has always had its stars, but then there were the men who didn't just play tough, they were tough. These weren't pampered celebrities waiting for the spotlight. They were soldiers, brawlers, rebels, and survivors who carried scars that no makeup chair could ever hide. Some fought their way out of poverty with bare hands. Others earned medals in real wars before Hollywood ever called their names. A few lived so recklessly that their off-screen lives were more dangerous than anything the scriptwriters could invent. They drank hard, fought harder, and didn't care if Hollywood loved them or hated them. And that's exactly why audiences couldn't look away. These 10 men became legends not because they pretended to be tough, but because toughness was all they ever knew. From icons of the Western frontier to decorated war heroes and Hollywood bad boys, this is the real story of the toughest actors in Hollywood history. Let's start with the man who defined an entire generation of toughness, John Wayne. When you think of Hollywood toughness, the first name that often comes to mind is John Wayne. Towering at well over 6 feet, with that gravelly voice and steady gait, Wayne wasn't just acting tough, he built his entire career around embodying it. He became the face of the American Western, the ultimate cowboy who never backed down from a fight. But off camera, Wayne's toughness wasn't just an image. He was blunt, stubborn, and carried a reputation for being impossible to push around. Colleagues often described him as intimidating, not because he was loud, but because he never bent once he made up his mind. He clashed with directors, argued with co-stars, and wasn't afraid to voice strong opinions that often divided Hollywood. His worldview and politics sparked heated debates, but they also reinforced his image as a man who didn't care what others thought. To Wayne, being tough wasn't about pretending, it was about standing his ground no matter the cost. And while Wayne wasn't a soldier like some of the other men on this list, he fought his own battles in the public eye. He carried himself with a quiet dominance that made him a cultural symbol of rugged masculinity for generations. People may not have agreed with him, but they couldn't deny the authority he projected both on screen and off. John Wayne represented the toughness of a Hollywood legend. But the next man didn't just play tough roles. He lived through horrors most actors could never imagine. He was a real war hero who brought his battlefield courage straight into the movie business. Audie Murphy. Audie Murphy wasn't just Hollywood tough. He was the real deal. Before he ever set foot on a movie set, Murphy had already lived through horrors most people couldn't imagine. During World War II, this baby-faced Texan became the most decorated American soldier of the entire conflict. He earned the Medal of Honor, along with dozens of other awards for valor, after holding off waves of enemy troops almost single-handedly. And he did all of this before he was even 21 years old. When the war ended, Murphy was invited to Hollywood. At first, producers saw him as just a war hero with a marketable face. But once he stepped in front of the camera, it was clear he brought something that no acting school could teach: authenticity. In every performance, you could feel the weight of someone who had truly seen life and death up close. He didn't need to fake toughness, it radiated from him naturally. But the same experiences that made Murphy a legend also haunted him. He suffered from what we now know as PTSD. Nightmares, flashbacks, and violent mood swings followed him everywhere. He admitted to sleeping with a loaded gun under his pillow. Friends said he was constantly restless, unable to escape the war that had defined his youth. At a time when most stars hid their flaws, Murphy openly spoke about his condition, becoming one of the first public figures to raise awareness about the psychological wounds soldiers carried home. Murphy's life was a paradox, celebrated as the bravest of the brave, but tormented by memories he couldn't silence. He stood as living proof that toughness isn't just about medals or movies. It's about surviving battles inside and out, even when the scars never fully heal. Robert Mitchum. Robert Mitchum wasn't just another Hollywood star. He was the original bad boy. While many actors carefully guarded their images, Mitchum never bothered to hide who he was. He built a reputation for being tough, reckless, and impossible to control. That reputation wasn't just talk, either. In 1948, at the height of his career, Mitchum was arrested in a police raid for possession of marijuana. At the time, this kind of scandal could have destroyed an actor's career. For Mitchum, it only made him more infamous. He spent nearly 2 months in jail, and when he walked out, he treated it like it was nothing more than a publicity stunt. His career didn't collapse. In fact, it grew. Mitchum carried himself with a casual toughness that made him stand out from the polished leading men of his era. He had a rumbling voice, a half-lidded stare, and an aura that suggested he didn't care if you liked him or not. On and off the screen, he lived by his own rules. He drank hard, got into fights, and dismissed Hollywood's obsession with image. To him, being tough wasn't an act. It was who he was. But Mitchum's recklessness came with consequences. His drinking, his volatile temper, and his indifference to Hollywood politics made him a constant source of controversy. Yet those very qualities also made him unforgettable. Unlike many of his peers, Mitchum never tried to play the perfect star. He leaned into his flaws, and in doing so created one of the most authentic tough guy images the screen has ever seen. And while Mitchum's toughness came from rebellion and defiance, the next actor's came from something far more brutal: the hard labor of surviving a childhood in the coal mines. Charles Bronson. Charles Bronson looked like a man carved out of stone, and his life story explained why. Born into a poor immigrant family in Pennsylvania, Bronson was one of 15 children. His childhood was brutal. His father died when Charles was still young, and by the age of 10, he was already working to help feed his family. At 16, he went underground into the coal mines, where the air was black with dust, and the work broke stronger men. Bronson later said he earned just $1 for each ton of coal he hauled out, back-breaking labor that hardened him long before Hollywood ever came calling. That rough start gave Bronson the kind of toughness that couldn't be faked. When he eventually made it to the screen, audiences believed him instantly. With his weathered face, intense stare, and quiet menace, he didn't need long speeches to convince anyone he was dangerous. His most famous role came in the Death Wish films, where he played a man taking the law into his own hands. For millions of fans, Bronson became the face of vigilante justice, a no-nonsense tough guy who delivered punishment without hesitation. But behind the scenes, Bronson was just as intimidating. He was famously private, sometimes cold, and rarely smiled. Co-stars often said he kept his distance and carried himself with the same intensity off-set that he did on camera. He wasn't known for being friendly, but he was respected because no one doubted his strength, physical or emotional. Bronson's legacy was simple but powerful. He showed that toughness doesn't need words, it only needs presence. And while his silence was commanding, the next actor's toughness came from being loud, rebellious, and constantly at war with authority. Steve McQueen. Steve McQueen wasn't called the King of Cool for nothing. On screen, he was magnetic, a man who could say more with a stare than others could with a page of dialogue. Off-screen, though, McQueen lived in a way that constantly tested how tough he really was. Born into hardship, abandoned by his father and raised in broken homes, McQueen grew up fighting for survival long before Hollywood discovered him. He was arrested multiple times as a teenager, spent time in reform school, and even joined the Marines, where he famously got demoted several times for insubordination. Authority was something McQueen never accepted easily. When he broke into Hollywood, that rebellious streak became his trademark. He performed his own stunts, raced cars and motorcycles at terrifying speeds, and lived life like he was in a competition with danger itself. He was fiercely competitive with co-stars, too, demanding more screen time, more lines, and clashing with anyone who tried to overshadow him. Stories from sets reveal that McQueen's cool exterior often masked a volatile personality. He could be charming one moment and explosively difficult the next. But what really set McQueen apart was his authenticity. He didn't just play the rebel, he was one. Whether it was walking away from big studios when he felt controlled, or insisting on doing risky stunts that terrified producers, McQueen refused to conform. That refusal made him a cultural icon of the 1960s and 70s, the ultimate anti-hero. Yet, McQueen's toughness had a cost. His battles with addiction, his volatile relationships, and his reckless lifestyle eventually caught up with him. He lived fast, and tragically, he died young. But his image, the fearless rebel who answered to no one, remains untouched. And before McQueen ever redefined cool, Hollywood had another tough guy who blazed a trail decades earlier. A man whose gangster roles made him both admired and feared. James Cagney. Before Hollywood had cowboys and rebels, it had gangsters. And no one brought gangsters to life like James Cagney. With his short frame, quick movements, and piercing eyes, Cagney created some of the most unforgettable tough guy characters of the 1930s and 40s. Audiences believed him because he wasn't polished or glamorous. He looked like someone who had actually walked those mean streets. Cagney grew up in New York's rough neighborhoods, where toughness wasn't optional. It was survival. That background gave him a natural edge that translated perfectly to the screen. When he delivered his famous gangster roles, there was a raw energy that came from experience, not just acting. But toughness wasn't just part of his characters. Cagney had a fiery temper in real life, and people who crossed him quickly learned not to underestimate him. He had no problem standing up to studio bosses, challenging contracts, or pushing back against anyone who tried to control him. At the same time, Cagney wasn't a one-dimensional brute. He was also a gifted dancer and brought surprising versatility to his career. That contrast, being able to play violent criminals in one film and light-hearted performers in another, only made him more impressive. Cagney's toughness came from his roots and his refusal to be intimidated, whether by rivals on the street or executives in Hollywood. He proved that being small didn't mean being weak. And while Cagney set the standard for gangster toughness, the next man brought a different kind of fire, a larger-than-life intensity, rooted in passion and raw strength. Anthony Quinn. Anthony Quinn brought a different kind of toughness to Hollywood, one that came from passion and fire. Born in Mexico to a family that faced poverty and discrimination, Quinn learned early what it meant to fight for us. When his family moved to the United States, he was often treated as an outsider, something that fueled his determination to stand tall no matter the odds. On screen, Quinn was unforgettable. With his rugged features, booming presence, and commanding energy, he embodied roles that required raw intensity. From Zorba the Greek to countless westerns and adventure films, Quinn's characters were never meek. They were bold, physical, and unafraid to challenge anyone who stood in their way. But Quinn's toughness wasn't just an act. Off-screen, he carried a fiery temperament that sometimes intimidated those around him. Known for being passionate and stubborn, he often clashed with directors and co-stars, unwilling to tone down his personality for anyone. His charisma was magnetic, but it came with an edge. You always knew there was a storm beneath the surface. What made Quinn stand out was that his toughness wasn't cold or distant like some of his peers. It was emotional. He poured everything into his performances and into his life, and that intensity made him unforgettable. Quinn proved that toughness doesn't always come from silence or stoicism. Sometimes it's born from fire and unshakable spirit. And if Quinn's strength came from passion, the next actor's toughness was defined by sheer physical presence and a career built on playing the most epic roles ever filmed. Charlton Heston. Charlton Heston wasn't just a movie star. He was a towering figure, both literally and symbolically. With his broad shoulders, commanding voice, and intense stare, Heston became the face of some of Hollywood's biggest epics. In films like Ben-Hur, The Ten Commandments, and Planet of the Apes, he didn't just play heroes, he embodied the kind of larger-than-life toughness that audiences craved. Part of what made Heston stand out was his physical presence. He carried himself like a man born for the battlefield, even when the fight was only on film. His discipline was legendary. Heston trained relentlessly for his roles, performing grueling stunts and enduring punishing shoots without complaint. Directors knew that if the job was difficult, Heston would take it on without hesitation. But Heston's toughness extended far beyond the screen. He was outspoken, fiercely independent, and never afraid to take controversial stances, even when they made him unpopular in Hollywood. That willingness to stand alone, no matter the backlash, gave him a reputation as a man who lived by his principles. Like many of the actors on this list, Heston wasn't always easy to work with. His intensity could border on intimidating, and he demanded a level of commitment from others that matched his own. But whether you agreed with him or not, there was no denying his authority. Heston's legacy is that of a man who carried epic roles with epic strength, proof that toughness can be as much about conviction as it is about muscle. And while Heston stood tall as Hollywood's epic hero, the next actor's toughness was far more personal, a fiery mix of charm, defiance, and a refusal to ever back down. Kirk Douglas. Kirk Douglas was more than just a star. He was a force of nature. With his cleft chin, piercing eyes, and raw energy, Douglas had a presence that demanded attention. He wasn't the tallest or the biggest actor, but he had an intensity that made him larger than life on screen. In films like Spartacus and Paths of Glory, he embodied characters who refused to be broken, and in many ways that mirrored the man himself. Douglas grew up poor, the son of Russian immigrants, and fought his way into Hollywood with little more than determination. That struggle shaped his personality. He was famously stubborn, often fiery, and never afraid of confrontation. Colleagues respected his talent, but also admitted he could be difficult. He pushed hard, sometimes too hard, to get what he wanted. One of Douglas's defining moments came when he used his influence to help end the Hollywood blacklist by giving credit to a blacklisted screenwriter on Spartacus. It was a controversial move at the time, but it showed that Douglas wasn't afraid to put his career on the line for what he believed in. Like many tough men, Douglas's strength sometimes came across as arrogance, and his personal life was far from spotless. Yet, that mix of charm, defiance, and fiery determination made him unforgettable. Kirk Douglas proved that toughness doesn't always come from physical power. Sometimes it's the sheer will to stand against the system itself. And if Douglas's toughness came from defiance, the next actor's came from lived experience, as a war veteran who carried his scars straight into Hollywood. Lee Marvin. Lee Marvin wasn't just another actor playing soldiers and tough guys. He had lived it. Before Hollywood, Marvin served as a Marine in World War II, fighting in the Pacific. He was wounded in battle, taking a bullet in the back, and carried those scars for the rest of his life. That real experience shaped everything about him, giving Marvin an authenticity that no acting class could replicate. On screen, Marvin became one of the most commanding presences of his generation. With his gravelly voice, scarred face, and towering frame, he looked like a man you didn't want to cross. Films like The Dirty Dozen and Point Blank cemented him as the kind of actor who didn't need to overact. His very presence radiated danger. But Marvin's toughness wasn't confined to the screen. Off-camera, he had a reputation for drinking hard, brawling, and living life on his own terms. Hollywood insiders knew that Marvin could be unpredictable, but they also knew he was the real deal. He didn't cultivate an image. His life had already given him one. What made Marvin stand out was that his toughness wasn't polished or glamorous. It was raw, sometimes messy, but always authentic. He carried himself like a man who had seen too much to ever be intimidated. Lee Marvin closed the chapter on an era of actors who didn't just pretend to be tough. They were tough. But Marvin wasn't alone. Together with the legends we've seen, he proved that Hollywood once had men whose toughness was more than a role. It was a way of life. These 10 legends proved that Hollywood once had men who didn't just act tough, they lived it. From John Wayne's larger-than-life authority to Audie Murphy's battlefield scars, from Mitchum's prison stint to Marvin's Marine grit, each of them carried something real that the camera couldn't fake. And maybe that's why they still fascinate us today, because no matter how polished or glamorous movies have become, toughness like this can't be manufactured. It has to be lived. If you want more untold stories from Hollywood's past, the legends, the scandals, the moments that shaped film history, make sure you're subscribed. The next story might just change the way you see your favorite stars forever.